There's something extremely satisfying about shooting handmade arrows, and for those of us lacking the tools and equipment to properly mill shafts from scratch, wooden dowels from the hardware store seem like a natural place to start. However, making arrows out of dowels is a bit of a point of contention in the archery community, so today I thought I'd take some time to clear up a few things on the subject. To start with, I found a video made by this lovely British man here, which brings together a lot of the points you'll often hear against making arrows out of dowels.
Let's do a sync shield hit, and let's hop into the video.
Everybody wants a good, solid, straight, dependable shaft, one that comes easily.
Alright, moving past that.
But of course, in this cash-strapped world where money is tight, there are temptations to do things on the cheap. And one of those things is, of course, arrow shafts. But I will say this, and I mean it seriously, do not skimp on your arrow shafts.
I totally agree with that. Don't use inferior materials for your arrows, or you can end up hurt.
Now, I'm here to inform you, again, very seriously, that doweling is not the same as an arrow shaft. So, what's the difference between an arrow shaft and some dowel that you've bought from your local DIY store? Well, for a start, as you can probably see, it doesn't really fit in the frame of the camera here. It's ginormous, it's probably about 7 or 8 foot. Now, obviously, this is very tempting. You think, oh, well, I'll get 2 or 3 out of that, and it's only, I think, £2.50, which is probably $3, maybe $4, something like that, for a piece this length.
I will admit that when I was a kid, I definitely thought that. I was like, wow, you get these in 4-foot lengths. I was a pretty short kid, so I was like, I could definitely get 2 full arrows out of this. You obviously can't. There are sections in a 4-foot dowel that have straight grain, but you probably aren't going to ever find one that has completely straight grain across the whole length.
For a start, if you hold them in your hand, if you have got obviously a normal arrow shaft and the dowel, they feel completely different. The dowel isn't finished at all. It's very, very roughly sawn, whereas the arrow shaft is quite well sanded and finished.
Well, you know, holding this scrap of leather, it feels completely different from this finished knife sheath. It's one of them is very rough, and you see how ridiculous that sounds? An arrow shaft, when it's sent out to you, is a finished product. It might need some very, very light sanding and a coat of finish, be that oil or lacquer or whatever, but it's a finished product. A dowel shaft is stock. It's material for making an arrow shaft out of, so of course they feel different.
Also, the shape. The dowel is not round. It really isn't. It's oval at best.
I don't doubt that the one in your hand is oval at best, but
This is a dowel straight from the hardware store. I haven't done any work to it apart from cutting it to length, and it's about 0.1 millimeter or 4/1000ths of an inch out of round. This purpose-made arrow shaft is out by about the same margin, but this isn't nearly enough to negatively affect the finished arrow.
And they also tend to have a ridge. The process that they go through of milling these, it's almost like they're done in 2 halves.
that is a quality control issue. There are a lot of dowels in the bin that are going to have that weird ridge on them. You have to find the ones that don't. Obviously, those aren't suitable for making arrows out of.
The other difference, and this is really where we get to the reason why you should not be using this to make arrows, is the grain.
Okay, before you even show an image, I can see the grain lines running like 45 degrees on that dowel. That is a terribly grained dowel. You would never want to make an arrow shaft out of that.
Now this one is an example of an arrow shaft where the grain, these long lines of the grain, doesn't run entirely from one end to the other, but is still perfectly acceptable and perfectly usable, as I say, using that rule of thumb of a sort of about a minimum of 6 inch.
That would not be a fantastic looking dowel. In fact, I've found many dowels that look much better than that. In fact, that's probably the worst one I would ever actually buy out of the bin. If that had any more runoff, I would just leave it there. This is a pretty good dowel, but it's still fairly representative of the ones that I try to look for. And you can see it's got grain running all the way from one end to the other, and it only has one spot of runoff across the entire shaft.
Now if we compare that to the grain on this randomly picked out piece of dowel.
What? Dude, you can't randomly select a piece of... Okay, I'm obviously playing this up because I've seen this video before. You can't just go to the hardware store and just monkey fist a couple of dowels and expect those to make good arrows.
Now you can see the lines of the grain there. They go pretty much at right angles to the wood.
Yeah, that's a terrible looking dowel. That's horrible grain structure. You'd obviously never make an arrow out of that.
And you can see the knots as well that I was talking about.
Quality control issue. Not every single dowel has knots, though a lot of them do. You got to pick through them.
Now, you may be wondering, well, what does that mean? What problem does that cause? Well, unfortunately, that means it's very, very likely to break.
Yep, that dowel with that grain structure, absolutely going to break. No doubt in my mind about that. In fact, I'm fairly certain he's going to break it in just a moment or two here. I know he's going to break it because I already watched the video.
Now I'm going to try and demonstrate the difference between this arrow shaft and the difference between this piece of dowel. I'm going to cut one to length so it matches the length of this, and I'm going to show you how much you can actually bend this arrow shaft and how little you can bend this dowel before it breaks.
So here's the thing. He's already shown that this dowel is crap, so I don't feel like watching him break it on camera is especially productive. I'm going to anyway because I like watching things break.
I'm going to put the weight on and we'll see what happens. Get the picture?
That was just as satisfying as I thought it would be. Now this is a 5/16 dowel. And this is a 5/16 arrow shaft spined to 40 to 45 pounds from Three Rivers Archery. Now I've got a 2-pound weight and I've got them set up between two pieces of wood. Now the dowel had about a 1/2 inch of deflection, while the arrow shaft had about 5/8 worth of deflection. So it's very similar with the dowel being very slightly stiffer. And again, this is a dowel that I very carefully picked out and chose for its qualities. Get the picture?
Now try and imagine if you're actually using that dowel and you're actually shooting with it. So you've drawn the arrow back, and when you let the arrow go, it does an awful lot of bending. If that breaks, that's going to go straight into your hand.
Any arrow that is damaged or underspined for the bow can shatter and explode into a million pieces when you let go of the string. That is not a problem that's exclusive to dowels.
So it really, really, really is important that you don't use inferior materials when you're making your arrow shafts.
And on that point, my man, we are in 100% agreement. If you use inferior materials, you are likely to get hurt.
I can't speak for all the retailers, but I know that we go through the batch that we get in, we check them, make sure that there aren't any cracks or what have you. Cracks do appear, particularly when materials are drying out, etc. So we always make sure that when we send you out shafts, if you place an order, that we've checked them thoroughly before we send them out.
That is a commendable business practice. And in fact, I tried to order the arrow shafts that I'm using for this video from this shop in particular, but they only ship to the UK, unfortunately. But you can see that even when you have specially made arrow shafts, some of them still turn out as lemons. Some of them are still bad. When you have an arrow shaft making process, you're going to be more careful and end up with a greater quantity of desirable material. When you make dowels, it's less important that they're good quality because of what they're generally used for, so you're going to end up with a lesser quantity of desirable materials. A lesser quantity, but that doesn't mean none.
But I hope I've explained the dangers of doing so. I'm not trying to frighten anyone, but it just really does worry me that people are still doing this and still talking about doing this and still considering going out and using cheap doweling to make arrow shafts.
Yeah, that worries me too. I would never want someone to watch my video and not go through the entire process, go out and grab some random dowels and then end up hurting themselves. That genuinely does worry me as well, and this guy seems pretty open and honest, and I like him, and I'm sorry that he's been the brunt of my rude sarcasm. I'm standing up today. Maybe I should put something over top of this so you don't have to look at my dumb face so much. The point that I want to make, if you find a dowel that has the proper grain structure, free of knots, cracks, and splitting, and with the proper spine value for the bow you want to shoot it at, that is functionally no different from an arrow shaft. It's a piece of wood milled down into a long cylinder with all the qualities of an arrow shaft. So to say that you can't make arrows out of dowels is ridiculous. That absolutely isn't to say, and I don't want anyone to take this away from either this video or my previous one, that you can make arrows out of any old dowels. You have to find the ones that have all the right properties. You have to flex test them vigorously to make sure that they're not going to break. And even once you finish the arrows, and this goes for any arrows you shoot, not just ones made out of dowels, regularly flex test and safety inspect them to make sure that they're still sound. Making dowel arrows is not for everyone. If you just want to make a quick and easy set of arrows, buy a set of arrow shafts. But if you're willing to put in a little bit of work and just enjoy the process of arrow making, dowels are a fantastic resource. And that is all I have for you today, guys. Go out there, make some fantastic arrows, be safe about it, and I'll see you around. Archer, I don't have my hat. Bye.